The first chart that we created was a bar chart, and we just used few rectangles, and we're able to create our first chart. Now that we're equipped with a lot of knowledge of how to work with React and D3 and how to architect that, we can create a more sophisticated chart. This chart that we're going to create is going to show the most popular framework in 2020. This data is taken from Stack Overflow, and the chart has few things. There is a vertical mean line that shows where is the vertical line in terms of the results. Once you hover over a bar, there is a CSS transition to change the color. We have a tooltip that's it's a line on the top of each bar, and we have a gradient color that goes from left to right to kind of point out the more popular framework. Also, once we resize our browser, we can see that all the elements are getting resized as well. So this is really a sophisticated way and kind of put together a lot of the knowledge of what we learned so far and create a chart that can give us an idea and show us how to really put all the elements together. The best place to start is really from the data. If you look at the public data, I created the bar CSV, and what I did is I went to Stack Overflow and I took the data for all the popular frameworks for 2020 of all the frameworks, and I created the CSV that has two columns, framework and value, and I put those data, and each framework is represented by a percentage, and together it kind of gives us really a good idea of the popularity of each framework. Now, again, I'm going to put it in data, bar CSV. Now that we have the data ready, we can use the generate React CLI to create our widget component. So for the widget component, I'm going to call it bar chart. And for the widget, we can call it bar chart widget. Let's create that. Then after we get that created, our next step is really to start from the entry point. Entry point, it's app.tsx, and inside we need to add the new widget we just created. So it's bar chart widget. You can see if you look at the final code of the application, I left all the other components we created, so it's easy to comment it out with just one line. So you can really work with the same library to create all those charts. Okay, now that we have our, we have to import it. Yeah, I commented out by mistake. So we can just uncomment it. Okay, now let's take a look at the bar chart widget. Let's do little fixes. Our component is called bar chart. So let's change that to bar chart, bar chart, bar chart. And here in the, when we render, then the other thing we need to do is, I'm gonna keep the dimension as is for now. Now we need to load the data. Just gonna be using the same code we did for the other chart because we're not loading a JSON. We're gonna be loading CSV. So I'm pointing to the CSV file, and for we need to make the changes in the types. So if we look at the types, the first value needs to match our CSV. So if you look back at the first value is framework, and the second property is value. So change that here, framework and value, so the type match. And also when we call the chart, remember we're setting up the metrics, so the property's name need to match. It has to be framework and it has to be value. Let me see that I call it framework. Okay. So we're ready with the widget, and one more thing that I want to do here this time is let's create a header 3, and in our header let's call our header 2020 frameworks popularity. Okay. To wrap a tag, a div, or any tag, otherwise this conditional statement won't work. So I'm gonna wrap it in a we don't need any div, we're not putting any properties. I'm just aligning it and creating a opening and closing a tag. Okay. Oops, you see it looks like it created at the end h3. Okay, here we go. We also need to change the helper to bar chart helper and bar chart. So bar chart helper, that's going to be our helper. Let's see, we got one more error. See if it doesn't disappear. Okay, disappear. Okay, so our widget is ready. Now we can start working on our bar chart. I'll start off by setting the resizing code, and the resizing code is exactly as we did before. What we need to do is we need to create a use effect, and inside we need to listen to changes. So we can use the exact same code we did before, and we need to set up all the states. So we need to set the previous height and previous width. We did all that stuff a couple times before. So I'm just going to copy that. Okay, so we're setting, now we're going to listen to change event, and then we're going to call the memorize callback and then memorize update if it's a change. On the first load, we want to call both the memorize drawback and memorize update. And on a second call, we want to just call the update. Now let's take a look at it. It looks like I'm not seeing anything. Let's make sure. Yeah, because our bar chart widget has to be inside of the header tag. So, okay, we only have the headline, and it's capturing those resizing event, but we're not drawing anything yet. Now the next step for us is to decide how we're going to handle the elements. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to set most of the element as JS6, and then we can access those elements if we need anything, if we need to make changes on a resize or anything else we're doing. So we need to put a bracket because we're going to expand that div. Let's open and close the div and close the bracket, and then inside of our div we need to put few elements. We need to put the SVG element, and let's follow the same structure we did before. We gave the ID and the name wrapper, and for the width we use the property dimension. So property.dimension.width, and the same with the height. So prop dimension height. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to create the bound. So we can close the SVG and we can create our bound. So we used a G element, and let's give it an ID of bounds and give it a style of, again, when we're doing a style in JSX, we need to put a double brackets, and we're going to use the transform to align it to the left top corner, the transition, the translate. So translate template, all of this we did before. So prop dimension, margin, left, and we need to do the same for the top. Don't forget to put the pixel. I forgot before, and it's then you have to debug it and see why it's not aligning things right. So we need to put it left top corner, and we can close our group tag. Actually, we don't want to collapse it, we just want to close it on a different line, because inside of our group we're going to put our elements that we're going to be using. So we're going to create a few elements. First of all, we need to create a group for bars. We need to create a group for x-axis and y-axis. And we need to create a line for that mean line you saw. So I'm going to give it an ID of mean, and I'm also going to give it a class name because we're going to set it in our CSS instead of doing it programmatically. Then also, if you remember, we had a text sitting on top of the mean line with the results of the mean. So it's called mean text as ID. So that's it. We got our basic JSX working. Let's see what it's complaining about. It's complaining about formatting, and I'll show you a little trick. If I go here and I do yarn format, it's gonna go and use the the script command from the package. So if you remember, in the package JSON, we already have the formatter, the format, and that's gonna format everything for me automatically, you see? So if you see any problem with the formatting, that's a really neat way to do it instead of trying to figure out yourself. One error that it's complaining that the helper is not being used because we haven't implemented it, but that's okay. So now we have a JSX ready. The next step is to start drawing all the elements. For now, we don't need to put anything in when we first draw. We don't need all this code, so we can get rid of it. I'm going to delete all the code and just leave it to do. And inside of our memorize update callback, with all the heavy lifting. Don't forget to update the dependencies in the memorize draw callback. And inside of the memorize update callback, we'll do all the heavy lifting. We have set up already from the template the scales and the bounds, but inside of the scale, we need to set our scales. In the bar chart helper, we have all this code that came with the template that I set for us. So we need to change the scale. So for the X scale, we're using a bar. So for bar, we're going to use a scale function that's called scale band, and that's going to create us those bars. And for the domain, we need to map. We can get rid of we can rewrite the domain. Let's do this. Let's rewrite the domain. So first, in terms of the range, we're going to use 0 to width. In terms of, we don't need the nice. In terms of another thing we need to think about is the padding. So we can actually add a padding, and that way we're going to get space between the bars, and we can do it in the scale. And in terms of the domain, what we're going to do is we're going to use the data, and we're going to map it using the accessor. So we can call the helper dot xaccessor, and that's going to map for us those bars. In terms of the Y scale, we can use a linear scale with the height. That's going to be a number result, so scale linear works good for that. In terms of the range, we're going to use the height and 0, so that's good. And then in terms of domain, let's just rewrite the domain. In terms of domain, what we need to do is we need to create an array, and in the array, the results are gonna be from 0 because it's running numbers, right? And then to the maximum possible results. So we need to map, go through the data and figure out what is the the highest result that is possible. So we can do it in the inline function, and then we can check using max. We can extend the data and map it. All of this shouldn't be new to you. We've done this before, and we need to use the Y accessor. So helper that Y accessor, and compare it to value of 0 to get the maximum result. Then we need to cast that as type number array. There you go. So now that we have our scales, we have our accessors, we're really ready to continue. What we can do is we can start by drawing the actual chart. So let's start by drawing those bars. And to draw the bars, we're going to do D3, and then we're going to select the element that we set at the JSX code. We called it bars, if you remember. So if you go back to the JSX, you can see we have the bar group. So we're going to attach our bars to that bar group, and we're going to use the enter to add those rectangle. So we need to do select all, and we'll call those bars bar. Each bar will call the bar, each rectangle. And then we need to assign the data so we can iterate through the results, and we need to tell it to start iterating once we enter the DOM. And what we're doing is we're appending a rectangle, and we need to set the now we need to set the attributes. The attributes we need the fill, and for now we can just set them to just a keyword number. Later on, as you saw, I have it set as a gradient, so we'll change it to a gradient. Then for the class, we're gonna call them bar. So it's, you see, and that's how we're gonna select all of them. Let's see what else we need. Then we need to set the X, the Y, we need to set the width, and we need to set the height. So for the X, we're gonna create an inline method for the data, and what we need to do is we need to for the X, for the location, we want to really use the scales, the X scales. So we'll use scales that scale X scale for the X location, and we have to put a return. And then for the, we need to cast it, otherwise you see we're getting those errors. So we need to pass the data framework, and we need to cast that as a string. And then you see we're getting an error here from TypeScript. It's complaining because the data could be undefined. So you see, it's complaining because of the overload and it could be undefined. So to kind of overwork that, we can say that if it's 0 results, then return 0. That way we kind of making sure our code is not going to break, and it wants a conversion to unknown first. So you can see I could have used TS ignore like I did before, but this time I just want to show you, if you really want to use TypeScript for the fullest, you can make sure that some results are going to come back, so you know our code is not going to break. So I added the 0. And then the same with the Y. With the Y attribute, it's the same process, we're just using the Y scale, and then we're using the D value instead of the D string, and the value needs to be of type number. So that's for the Y. Now we need to also set the width and height. So our attribute for the width and an attribute for the height. For our width, we can use the X scale, and inside of the X scale there is a method called bandwidth. So if you click in the X scale, you see there's a bandwidth, and the bandwidth, if I go into that method, so it's part of D3, and what it does, it brings the width of each band. So when we create those beans for the bars, each band is gonna represented by a width. So we want the width of each bars to get calculated for us, and that's what I did with the width. In terms of the height, we want to go through iterate through D3, and we want to return the bound of the height minus the Y scale. That way we can get the height. So we need to do a calculation based on the size of our bound. So we need to check the size of the bound, which is dimension dot bound height, and then we need to reduce the size of our bar. And to do that, we can just calculate that using the Y scale, passing the D value, and we're gonna have to cast it as number. Look like I have a typo at the return. Okay, return. Okay, so now we have our we're drawing our bars. Like we're getting one error. Property values does not exist of data. Did you mean value? Yes, I did mean value. So I had a typo here. Okay. Now if we go and reload, you could see that it's Great, it drew for us our rectangle. And for now, it's not resizing. We haven't set code to resize, but you can see we drew those bars. If we want to get our component to resize, what we need to do is we need to, when there's a change of the width or height, we need to remove those rectangle because we're adding them through D3. So we're really taking over. So we can do it by, instead of the memorize callback, what we can do is we can add some code to call D3 and select all the rectangle that we created. And now if we go back to the browser, you could see that it's getting resized nicely. So now we're really handling the resizing. So you could see what we're doing here. We're letting React taking over on most of the elements, but some elements that we need calculation and help with, we're handling that ourselves. And that's really the way to go. We want to let React handle as much as possible, but we shouldn't be afraid to let D3 use the DOM and do the calculation, and we can handle whatever change needs to be done. One more thing I want you to see is when we look again at our chart, it looks like we don't have enough space from the bottom. So what we can do is we can go to the widget and change the bottom from 20 to 50. And that's gonna just give us a little bit more space. We have to change it in two places. We need to change it when we first initialize, and we need to change it once we change the dimension. So now, as you can see, now we have a little bit more space to work with because I'm adding more padding from the bottom. Next, let's create our mean line. To create our mean line, we're gonna need the helper because we need to use our Y accessors. So we can create an instance. So if you go into our helper, in the template, if you go to the top of the template, you'll see something. I left you here a comment how to implement. You can see helper. So you can copy that, and so we can use our helper. And we need to pass the properties. So the properties are property names. And now that we have new instance of our helper, see why it's complaining? Okay, we need to be one line before. Okay, so now that we have our helper, we need to create our mean. And to create our mean line, we need to calculate what is the mean value of all those bars. And to calculate it, D3 has a method for that. So we can create a mean constant, and then we can use D3 mean, and then we can pass our data and our accessor. So the accessor we need, because we're using the Y for the number, so we need the Y accessor, and that's going to give us the mean number, calculating it out of all the data that we're passing on. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to calculate what is that mean value that we got in terms of our Y pixel location on the screen. So to do that, we can use the scales, Y scales, and pass that mean value that we got, and now we have the location on the Y, so we can draw it. And now that we have all the data really set for us, it doesn't like the mean because it expects a number, so we need to cast that as a number, the result. That did the trick. And then the next thing we need to do is we can select our element, and we can draw our line. So if you look at the mean, you could see we created at the JSX a line element, and if you remember for line, it's a SVG line element, and our line element expect a few properties. We need to set it with x1, x2, and y1 and y2. So let's go back to our code, and to set it we can call the select, and we can, for the selector, we can use our mean ID, and we can set our x1 and x2 as well as y1 and y2. So x1, x2, and y1, y2. So our starting position for the x is 0, and our end position for the x is our property dimension, our bound width. So dimension bound width, that's going to give us, for the mean, we want it to start from 0 and to go all the way down. And for the y1, y2 location, what we want to do is we can just use the value that we set, the mean to y, and the y1 and y2, we need it as a straight line, so we're going to use the same value. Then the other thing we need is we need to set style for the font size, and to put the anchor in the middle. And we don't need to write it in code. What I've done already, I created a CSS for us that already include the value for the mean line. Let's just look at the CSS. So we're giving it a stroke of white, and then the dash array, we're using stroke dash array, and the first property means how much we want to fill. So 20 pixels is how much we want to fill, and the 10 pixel is the space between. So we got 20 pixels line, and then 10 pixel space, 20 pixel line, 10 pixel space. Now let's take a look. When we refresh our browser, here is our mean line. You can see it. And also, if you look at the CSS, I already put a rectangle hover state, and I'm using a fill of HSL with the color of purple and intensity and 80 for the saturation. So once we hover over our bars, you could already see that it's working, the hover state. Next, we want to create our mean text. And for the mean text, you can close all the other files, we don't need them. For the mean text, if you remember, we already set it up here. So we have a text element that it's ready to be used. So after we create our mean line, we can also create our mean text. And what we can do is we can do again D3, and I like to use select all because it's making sure there's no extra properties just in case. And then we call it mean text, and then we need to set the attribute for the text. We need to set x, y, text. So let's set that up. We'll use, for the x method, what we want to do, I want to position it at the end of the bound, but just before the end. The reason that I'm doing that is because our bar is going down, so it's just going to look nicer over there. Take a look. So if I'm using props, dimension, bounded width, which is the whole size of our bound, and then I'm going to remove some pixels so it's a little bit before, otherwise we may not see it. It's gonna go outside of the bound. Y attribute, we can set it really using the scales. So what we want to do is we want to get the location of the mean, which we already have that mean to y, so we can use that, and then we can put it a little bit above that. So I'll use -10 to kind of put the y a little bit above, and then for the text, what we can do is we can use template style and just type in mean and put the mean value and at percentage. And then in terms of the fill and other property, I already set it for us at the bar chart SAS. So you can see we have a fill of white, font size of 12, and we want the text anchor, we want it set to the middle. And we also need to make sure that our element has the class. Okay, so set the element class to mean text. And now when we go back and refresh, here you go. We got the mean line, and then we have the mean text, but look, it gives us 17.775. So what we can do is we can make a small change to the text, and we can use to fix. So we have only 2 digits, so it just looks display a little bit better. There you go. For the peripherals of the x-axis and y-axis, we can just use the same code that we did previously. There's no change here. We need to use the d3 axis left and use the scales for the y, and set it to the y-axis, and the same with the axis on the bottom for the x-axis. So this is the same code, so I just copied it from our previous project we created. Then if you go back into our chart, refresh, you can see that it's creating us the x-axis, the y-axis, and our resizing is working. The next step is we want to take those beans bars, and we want to change the color. That white just doesn't do it for me. So what we can do is we can take similar approach to what we did with the area chart. And if you remember the basic area chart we created, we wrote a gradient, a linear gradient inside of using D3. But what we can do is we can do the same thing inside of our JSX code. So to do it inside of our JSX code, we can edit inside as a definition inside of our SVG. You can see here I collapsed our element just so we can see it better. And inside of our SVG, we can create a definitions tags. And JSX really mimics HTML, and it's going to work the same way. And inside of our definition tags, we can put a linear gradient, and let's give it an ID of gradient, and then we also need to we'll use the gradient units, and we'll use the user space on use. So this is really match how we had it with D3, but this time we're just doing it inside of our JSX code. And then we need to create those stop element. So it's going to be stop, and then we need to set the offset, and we need to set the stop color. Now, if you remember in D3, we did it with HTML format, which was stop color. In JSX, it's going to be stop color with the camel case style. And what we can do is we can create 3 of those. Let's format it. Okay, and then for the offset, we can use 0 50% and 100%. And then for this top color, the last lesson we spoke about HSL, and I want to really show it to you in a practical example. What we can do is we can use an orange color and we can give it the same saturation and lightness, and then what we can do is we can change those. We can keep the same color and just make changes to the saturation. So we can start from 100% because we're starting from left to right, and then we can reduce it to 50%, and then we can reduce it to 25%. And that way it's going to give us that the color is going to stay the same. It's just going to reduce the saturation of the color. Make sure we have to make sure we close the stop tags. Let's close those stop tags. Okay. And it's complaining this tag has to be in line with the opening tag. Okay, now it's working. Now that we have our gradient, we can take that gradient and just use it as our fill for our beans. So if we go back to the beans, you see we use a color of white, and what all we have to do is, and we did it with the area chart, we did the same thing, we just need to change that that color to the URL of the gradient that we set. If we go back and refresh our browser, you can see that we got this nice gradient. So we have, you know, the jQuery is the most popular framework, so it really gets the most saturation, and then the saturation go down from left to right, so it's kind of highlighting jQuery and React and Angular versus the other results.